This video is going to cover key terms related to setting. Let's start with the general setting. The general setting describes the historical or cultural context for the narrative, the basic framework of the story. So for example, if you have a text that's set in World War I, that gives you a good sense of some of the key elements that you need to understand in terms of the time frame of that text and a major world event that's going on that's going to affect what happens in the text. You could also have texts that are set, for example, in some fantastic imaginary setting. You need maybe to decode the rules of the world of that text before going any further to understand what the basic elements are. And then you might even have some other settings like a real location that just helps you to understand what is the framework and the basic rules for the text. So all of these general settings are very different, and they would give us a good sense of the framework coming in at the start of the text. The particular setting is the focused specific setting that often applies to part of the narrative. Particular setting applies to both physical and temporal settings within the narrative, and let's talk about what those are. So the physical setting in the narrative is the location where the narrative or part of the narrative takes place. There's often multiple physical settings in a text, and how that physical setting is described can be just as important as what is being described. So, for example, if you looked at both of these as settings, you could easily say, well, the story takes place in a room. That's not going to get you very far analytically, though technically it is true. On the other hand, if you start to take a look at some of the specific details of those spaces, that can really help you use physical setting as an analytical tool. So by noticing the sort of four-poster bed and the more old-fashioned furniture in the one hand versus the very sparse minimalist look in the setting on the other hand, that could be a very significant element of the text. The fact that there is a closed door on the setting on the left, that might be a really important element. Let's say the door is locked and that's a major plot point. So starting to focus in on specific details of physical setting really helps you to use setting as an analytical tool. If you're overly general, you won't give yourself enough information to be able to use setting for analysis. So if we took a look at these two settings, we could describe both of these as in the mountains by a river, but that would really undermine some of the detailed elements. The setting on the right we could describe as isolated or tranquil or peaceful. And depending on how it's described in the narrative as well, the specific word used to describe that setting is going to really have an effect on the meaning of the setting within the world of the text. So just a few examples to help understand how we want to really focus in on the details of particular physical settings in text in order to use setting as an analytical tool. Finally, let's talk about the temporal setting. So temporal setting has to do with elements of the story that are related to time. So a few examples of what this might mean. The duration of the plot action. So let's say the plot starts with the birth of a character and goes on for their whole life. The duration of the action that takes place in that story would be the lifetime of that character, which could be for decades. Some stories take place everything all in one day or even 1 hour. So that duration, how long it takes for the action of the plot to take place, can be an important temporal element. If there are gaps in time, so for example, we're going along in a coherent linear way, and then there is a break in the text, and then it's 5 years later, and those breaks might draw your attention again for analysis. Disruptions in the chronology, so something like a flash forward or flash back, which you can hear more about in the plot part of the unit. Moments where the action of the text is disrupted, the linear chronology of the text is disrupted, whether forward, back, or in some other way. And then actions taking place at a specific time, like a monster that comes out from under a bed only at nighttime. So nighttime then becomes a relevant element of the temporal setting that you can use for analysis. This covers the basic key terms for setting. The general setting helps you understand the framework for the text, And then physical and temporal settings, when we analyze those, we want to talk about the particular physical and temporal settings, the specific elements and moments in the text that are important. And remember, the more specific you are in identifying those elements, the better you're going to be able to use those as analytical tools.